So the title of my talk is Who Pays to Avoid Climate Change and How Much Does It Cost to Avoid Climate Change? And so 2 points that I'd like to make. On the one hand is what are the magnitudes that we're talking about when we talk about avoiding climate change? And the second one is what is the framing in terms of economic, political, and philosophical debates on who is affected and who should be paying for it. Now, before doing so, I'd like to implement what climate change really is in the broader picture, because I think we tend to forget about these daunting challenges that are ahead of us. So that we're actually doing something that we haven't experienced for a very long time. So currently, the atmospheric concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is around 400 parts per million, and it's up from around 270 to 280 parts per million as a pre-industrial average. And we're currently adding around 3 to 4 parts per million per year. So that rate has been increasing over the last decades. So we're adding a huge chunk of it, and we're adding it rather rapidly. And so what does 400 parts per million really mean? Our planet hasn't experienced 400 parts per million for the last 800,000 years. And the modern Homo sapiens, so we basically, as a species, only came along 250,000 years ago. So we, as a species, have not experienced this kind of atmospheric concentration of carbon ever. And so this is quite an experiment that we're running here. And what is even more important, for the last 7 to 8,000 years, so since 5000 BC, when humans started to settle down and build cities, and first civilizations that what we would call civilizations came along, the temperature has only varied around 1 to 1.5 degrees of Celsius. So this is what we are used to in terms of our infrastructure, in terms of our plants, in terms of what we do and have been known to be doing. And our current levels of CO2 emissions already commit us to somewhere between 1 to 1.3 degrees of warming. So that is already quite a lot. Now, bear in mind that what I'm saying here are averages or the mean estimate. There are, of course, broad error bands around this. There is a big scientific uncertainty, particularly because we haven't experienced this before, so we don't really know what it means to emit so much CO2 in the atmosphere. And so what we're really running here is an existential experiment. It's existential because it has the potential of wiping us out, and it's an experiment because we don't really know what's happening, and we are not really able to repeat this experiment. So it's not that we can just say, okay, let's see what happens if we warm the world to 500 ppm, and then have another trial experiment and see what happens if we don't do it. So it's really a big problem that climate change is facing us with large, deep uncertainties where we don't know where we're heading. And projections for not fighting climate change imply that we would increase levels of atmospheric carbon from about 700 to 800 parts per million, and that number increases further if we have favorable economic growth within developing countries or less developed countries, which we, of course, on more general grounds would prefer to see. And the 700 to 800 figure would imply a warming of 4 degrees Celsius with substantial chances of higher increases, so going beyond 4 degrees Celsius. Now, nobody knows what 4 degrees Celsius really means. We have no idea what this means in terms of averages. So, again, we're talking about average increases in global mean temperature. We don't know what this means in terms of variation. We know that cyclones are more likely to increase. We know that there are some tipping points that could be set off by increasing global warming to that degree. The usual cases that are named are, on the one hand, melting of the Arctic ice sheet. You could have a collapse of the Gulf Stream. You could have a massive release of methane in the current permafrost in the northern regions of the northern hemisphere. So there are a lot of things where we don't know what 4 degrees actually mean, and we don't know what that means for stabilizing the climate. So it's unlikely to think that we go to 4 degrees Celsius, then we turn off the tap, and then we'll slowly go back to what we saw before. So that's probably not going to happen. And if it's going to happen, it's going to take a very long time. It's a time scale of centuries or millennia to we actually return to pre-industrial levels. So that's just to implement what we're talking about in the physical science of it. And there's a very good article by Nicholas Stern in the Journal of Economic Literature that appeared in 2013, where he's trying to talk about these implications. And so I only took up the geophysical component. Stern then goes on and talks also about what this might imply for our socioeconomic systems in terms of drought and what droughts and what changing weather patterns might imply for struggles or wars and upheavals within our societies. Okay, so this is as a preamble in a way, and so now the prelude or the overture is over, and I would like to talk about more about the climate economics of it. So climate change is a really complex problem, and so as I just mentioned, there are very large uncertainties in terms of geophysical implications. There are large implications for environmental species, so plants and the biosphere in terms of environmental outcomes. I will talk about the economic implications and considerations of climate change. Then, of course, there are further sociological and psychological and philosophical that we already talked about in the workshop a bit. So I just wanted to put that out there because I think also in the workshop, some of the contributors were a bit upset when it came to this analysis in terms of efficiency and sacrifice and seeing it as arguing that there are other considerations which have to be taken into account. And by saying this, I'm acknowledging this and saying at the same time that I will limit myself to economic analysis of it. Climate change is furthermore very complex because it has a very long time horizon. So it's not that there's a long delay between the cause and the effect. And of course, there are very large variances in the impacts of climate change across time and space. So certain regions are more prone to climate change than other regions, and of course that also changes over time. So that's why it makes it really hard to analyze climate change in a very detailed level. However, on a global scale, the economic analysis is fairly straightforward because human emissions of CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions in more general into the atmosphere are a negative externality. We've heard and talked about this quite a bit over the last couple of days. And that basically means that those people who are emitting CO2 or those entities like firms are not the ones who usually have to think about the costs of this action of emitting CO2 in the atmosphere. In a perfect competitive environment, such an externality would lead to a market failure and to an inefficient allocation of resources, basically implying that people think emitting CO2 is cheaper than it actually is, and so they generally would do more of it than we would want them from a socially optimal perspective. And the correction of this market failure through the implementation of institutions, and again, I'm very agnostic about this, this could be direct demand and control in the sense of outruling the burning of fossil fuel. It could be through a market-based system like a cap and trade, or it could be through taxation in just implementing a carbon tax. But if we're able to implement these institutions, which force the social cost of carbon onto the actors who are doing this harmful action, then we should be able to correct the externality without any opportunity cost. So that basically means that, of course, there will be a cost component, which is the carbon tax, and of course there will be a direct cost in the sense that we will have to make some investments in renewable energy, and we will have to restructure our energy systems, the modalities of transportation, maybe also the way that we live. But from a purely economic perspective, these are costs that are compensated by the costs of climate change that will occur later on in time. Okay, so this is the externality component. But what is the social cost of carbon? And I think that's where the economics comes in and can be quite useful. So how do we know what the damage of CO2 is? How do I know what this component in the cost calculations, which are not considered by firms, how can we calculate this? How can we estimate the social cost of carbon? And what economists usually do is then they go to a cost-benefit analysis and say, okay, well, what is the cost of this? And basically, again, saying that this is a purely economic analysis, we tend to think about the damages that are done by climate change. So we can say, okay, so if I have climate change, then this will imply increased frequency of hurricanes, which means that there will be a lot of destruction of infrastructure through these weather events. Then there will be droughts, which means that the crop yields will be lower, so agricultural productivity will decrease. There will be some impact on the productivity of workers, maybe because they're prone to more vector-borne diseases. Maybe they're less able to work because the climate is just, their temperature just increases. So there are multiple channels in which you can argue and think about these economic damages of climate change. And so basically then what we would do is we would assume or try to come up and add on these different components of damages and assume different trajectories of climate change. So if I have a very high emission scenario, what would be the damages and what would be the damages in a very low scenario? And then you would see, well, depending on where I am, the social cost of carbon would differ. So basically what the social cost of carbon is you want them to have these damages in each point in time, and you want to add them up, right? So each year you have an additional cyclone, let's say, or a hurricane, and this hurricane costs you $50 million. Then you want to add this up over time and say, okay, so this is the cost of climate change. And then, of course, the adding up the costs in itself is not sufficient because as economists we also say, well, you have to take into account that this is happening in the future. And basically what you do is a no arbitrage calculation where you say, well, I want to know how much there's a difference between losing $1 in the future and losing $1 today, and that's basically the difference is the interest rate. So what would the difference be if I put the money into the bank and then I would have a deposit? So basically those are the different components, but what I didn't tell you so far is if you compute the social cost of carbon, of course you don't want to compute the whole cost of climate change, but you only want to know how much does it cost to emit the extra ton of carbon. So I would probably, and economists make assumptions that make it possible to compute these things, but I would only want to know how much more damage is not created by the additional hurricane, but just by the severity, or let's say the strength of the hurricane, by emitting an extra ton of carbon. So it's this marginal component, which again, something that came up in the workshop quite a bit, is that we're not talking about the whole cost of climate change, but we're talking about, when we talk about the social cost of carbon, is the extra ton of carbon that I emit. And I mean, you could think about it in a non-convex way and just say, well, for a thought experiment, let's say I can emit up to now, let's say I emit 100 tons of carbon, or gigatons of carbon, and there's no climate change, and I'm debating whether or not I should have the additional ton, the 101st ton, and that sets off climate change, and that sets off the whole hurricanes. Then, of course, I would take everything that's happening within this 1 ton, but presumably it's not a 0-1 distinction, it's a convex relation, and so you want to go along this line, and you want to know what the additional effect would be for each ton of carbon that you add up. So, to put it succinctly, or in economic speak, the social cost of carbon is the sum of all future marginal damages discounted by the interest rate that is prevalent in the market. And as I said before, the idea behind this is that if you put $1 into, well, I'm not going to talk about this, whatever. Okay, so basically this is what this is. Now the problem, of course, is that how do you compute this? And economists have fallen into the habit of building large numerical models where they basically want to set up models that run over a very long time horizon, which take into account very different effects, which might take into account different regions, which might take into account different alternative energy sources. So those are very complex models, and then at the end they spit you out a trajectory or a profile of the social cost of carbon. Now, I think for the purposes of this talk, or for the purposes of non-economists, I can basically present a very simple rule for the social cost of carbon that allows us to compute the social cost of carbon, and then also tells us what the different drivers of the social cost of carbon are in a very succinct manner. And so I'd like to walk you through the social cost of carbon and the optimal carbon tax in a way at this portion of the talk. So what is the social cost of carbon? Well, as I said before, we want to know how much damage does it create to emit 1 extra ton of carbon from now until this ton of carbon has left the atmosphere. So there are different steps what I need to know. The first thing that I need to know is, well, how long is the ton of carbon in the atmosphere, right? So what are we talking about? The one difference between the problem of acid rain and sort of the climate change is that the impact of CO2 in the atmosphere is a very long time horizon, where the problem of sulfur oxide in the atmosphere is a very short problem. So that goes away rather quickly. So in order to know what the geophysical impact or the carbon cycle is and how long carbon stays in the atmosphere, one can simply build a simple model, which is a box model, as it's usually called. I could add more boxes that I'm going to do here. Here I'm just going to use 2 boxes. But it's a very simple setup where you basically say, 1 ton of carbon goes into, there are different boxes in the atmosphere. I'm dividing the atmosphere into different boxes. And then I say, well, for what fraction of CO2 goes into what box? And each box then has a different depreciation rate. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to assume there are 2 boxes. One box which has no depreciation rate. So carbon enters, the fraction of carbon that enters into that box stays in the atmosphere forever. And then there's another component where there is a little bit of depreciation, but rather slow depreciation. And implicitly, I'm also assuming there's a third box where everything depreciates completely within one time period. So this is a model which has been, of the carbon cycle, which has been used fairly frequently in the recent couple of years because it's a very useful and not such a bad, as is being told, approximation of the carbon cycle. And so basically what you would say here is that, okay, so let's say 20% go into the box that never depreciates. So 20% of your ton of carbon will be around forever. Of the remaining 80%, 60% are absorbed immediately. So within the decade, within the time step, which is a decade here. So basically, I'm saying, okay, so there are oceans, there is the biomass, and some of that, within a decade, the biomass and the oceans will be able to absorb 60% of the remaining 80%. And whatever is left over, so 40% of the 80% that are not depreciating ever, have a depreciation rate such that there is about a half-life of the ton of carbon of around 300 years. So basically what you can think about, so this illustrates and very clearly that social cost, climate change is a very long-term problem. So only half of the ton that you emit today will be gone within 300 years. And so that tells you how big the time scale is. So if I do this, I can get a very easy expression, which basically you have here on the screen. And so I call the proportion it's left at time t, left. And so that's basically a simple formulation, which has geometrical depreciation, or radiative depreciation. Okay, so now I know how much of my carbon will be left in the atmosphere at what point in time. The next step to figure out is, well, how much damage does this ton of carbon cause at each point in time? And what I'm going to do here is that I have a constant marginal flow damages, so in each period of time, that's relative to GDP, and basically tells you that you have around 5% of GDP loss at a warming of 2 degrees Celsius. Now, again, this is a number that we can debate about. Some people say it's much lower. There are actually some people who say for the first degree or so you have benefits of climate change. There are other people who say, well, this 2 degrees is the absolute maximum. The IPCC, as you might know, is very committed to the 2 degrees warming due to the burning ambers considerations where they don't take into account that much economic damages, but non-economic damages as well. But you're free to choose whatever number you want to do, but if you follow my functional form, then we basically can say, okay, well, so I say it's linear in whatever's left in the atmosphere, then I have my 5.3% of GDP, and I have, of course, to multiply it to GDP, so my damages will be growing and falling with the size of the economy. So that then tells me, okay, in each period of time, I have a certain damage that's associated with the amount of carbon, or the amount of carbon that I emitted today that's still left at that point in time. So that's the second step. And as I said before, I'm assuming that there's a very linear relationship. I'm not considering catastrophic risks or regime risks where I set off some self-reinforcing tipping points or self-reinforcing phenomena in the carbon cycle which are making things even worse. So there are no tipping points in the system. And I have also not considered some of these co-benefits that we also talked about in our presentation. So I'm not talking about other economic damages which might be associated with greenhouse gases which are not due to climate change. So you can think about health effects of coal-fired plants, the adverse health effects of coal-fired plants. Those, of course, you could add to the social cost of carbon if you wanted to. But I'm abstracting from these also. Okay, so the next thing is, and that's a crucial thing again, and I think that's where there's a lot of overlap with a lot of the things that you probably have heard about the economic of climate change are entering here also. is that what is the interest rate that I want to discount my future damages with? So, as I said, I want to add up these marginal damages of each point in time, but I have to discount them at an appropriate discount rate. And so that should be the interest rate. And the usual interest rate falling out of the intertemporal optimization and consumption smoothing would be the Ramsey-Keynes rule, which basically tells you that, so this is the expression that I have here, and there are two components to it, right? So the discount rate R is, on the one hand, something called rho, and a second term that you add to it. So what are these two considerations that people have to think about? And so these are ethical choices, and mind you that I've operating in a utilitarian framework where I want to maximize the discounted sum of all future utility. And so the two considerations that enter here on the one hand are the discount rate, which is rho, which is the pure rate of time preference or the rate of time impatience, which is capturing the idea that if I have to delay my consumption, then I have a certain utility loss because I'm delaying gratification to tomorrow. And there's a big debate about, and this is a lot of the Stern-Nordhaus debate is around this the expression of R and the rate of time preference, or the rate of time impatience, where it basically tells you, well, what should this be? And it's an ethical choice. And some people say, well, it should be higher. And other people say, well, it's completely unethical to discount the well-being of future generations simply because they're happening in the future. I, for my person, have to say, I think I have a negative discount rate because it happens a lot to me that I get chocolate or something, I buy it, and then I think, oh, I'll save it for later. And by the time I want to gratify myself by eating the chocolate, I find out that it's gone bad. So this would actually speak for a negative discount rate, but that's maybe I'm an outlier here. So this is the one component that you have. The second component is where you're trading off, when you think about how you want to spread consumption across time in order to maximize the joint utility of everyone, what you have to take into account is the fact that those people might be richer or poorer depending on how the economic capabilities of the society will change. Over the last 100 years or so, we have seen, or actually since the start of the industrial era, we have seen a rapid growth in material well-being. So we're used to this constant economic growth, and these growth rates have been averaging somewhere around between 2 to 7% per year, I guess. In the heydays, it might have been 7. And so people are getting richer and richer. So if I assume that there's something like a varying degree of well-being due to my economic possibilities, then you should take these inequalities across time into account. So that's what usually is called intergenerational or intertemporal inequality aversion, which basically tells you, well, how much weight do I put on someone being poorer because they don't have a lot of income as compared to somebody richer. So this is also associated with a declining marginal utility of consumption. So as I get richer, we usually assume that the extra dollar that I receive is giving me less utility or less gratification. If I'm Donald Trump, the extra dollar won't matter as much as if I'm a student or somebody living on the streets. So that is this concept that's captured here. And if I employ this concept across time, it basically tells me, well, if people in the future are richer, then that in and of itself tells me I shouldn't care about them too much. And so if I have if you think about this expression here, if I have a high intertemporal inequality aversion, so if I do not want to have large differences in well-being, and if I have a high growth rate of the economy, then the second term is very large, which means the discount rate is very large. So these future damages are discounted to a smaller social cost of carbon today. And the idea behind it is very straightforward again. It basically tells you, well, if we're all billionaires tomorrow, or in 100 years, and we lose 1% of our income due to climate change, that's probably not such a big problem if we're very poor today, and we would have to do something about climate change today. So this is basically this idea where you have an intertemporal conflict of interest, where you basically say, okay, I have to do something for climate change today in order for you to benefit tomorrow. Well, you'll be richer anyway, so maybe I shouldn't be bearing the sacrifice of climate policy because I'm poor today. Now, of course, you could say that G is equal to 0 if I assume that if we've exhausted our innovative potential for growing the economy, then that would basically tell you that this component falls, should not be entering my consideration about the interest rate. Or I could even say, well, maybe there's negative growth. So maybe we'll shrink the economy, and that would, of course, then say, well, if you're poor in economic terms and you're facing climate change, that, of course, would create the imperative to do more against climate change. Okay.
Can you just remind me, how do Stern and Nordhaus treat G then? Do they treat it the same, or do they treat it differently as well?
Well, there's a difference in what Nordhaus and Stern do, in the sense that Stern assumes an exogenous rate of growth, and I forgot what that number was. I think it's 2%, but I'm not sure. And then, of course, on the other hand, you have Nordhaus, who uses an endogenous component, where you say that there's some accumulation of capital going on. This accumulation of capital determines how much growth you have or not. The crucial impact here is that both of these, Stern doesn't use an optimal growth framework, but still they make an assumption explicitly about what the growth of the economy is. Even Nordhaus does have an implicit assumption about the growth rate of the economy, because he then assumes that there's this exogenous growth in total factor productivities, or basically your productivity of capital and labor increases exogenously. So the same unit of capital becomes ever more productive as you go into the future. And I think his steady state, he assumes that this levels off at when 1 unit of capital is 35,000 times more productive than it is today. So he has a very strong driver of technological innovation and capabilities built into his system. A lot of the debate about limits to growth also hinges on this G, I would say, and maybe I'm happy to talk about this in the discussion a bit more. I didn't talk about it here so much, but of course there is a strong linkage to such considerations. Yes?
What was IIA? Or?
It's the intergenerational inequality aversion. So it's this parameter which tells you how much do I want to equalize, or how much do I not care about differences in well-being just because of economic capabilities. And there are arguments for saying that you want to have the constant. So I think one of the components that, to link it up with what John said, I think at some point we also talked about that you should leave them with the same possibilities, and so in that way you'd also think about it, and you could have a very strong inequality aversion, and if you try to go into infinity, you basically say that each generation should have the same level of consumption or well-being, material well-being. Okay, so then if I have the interest rate, finally, and given the way that I set up the problem, I can basically just do this I can sum these damages up over time, and basically what I get is the sort of rule for the social cost of carbon. And let me use my clicker, and I think I have to do this here. So basically what you can do then is you get a rule for the social cost of carbon, which depends on the one hand on your GDP and your damage parameter. So these are two components which we're happy to change, and again, depending on what I think about the growth rate of the economy, this would enter here. And then these are the components from the carbon cycle, and I didn't mention this, but I also assumed that, as I say here, that there's a lag between the temperature response and the emission of carbon. You see how R enters the expression here, and those are my ethical parameters about the intertemporal inequality aversion and the rate of discount. And so that's a rather straightforward expression, which is an analytically closed form solution. It doesn't capture all the finesses of a more fully fledged and numerical integrated assessment model, but I think for the purposes of this audience, it really tells you what are the drivers of social cost of carbon that economists like to think about. And so this is the expression for the social cost of carbon. And what I wanted to mention also is that, of course, I did not consider population growth. And one of the crucial issues, of course, that John raised is the problem if population growth might be endogenous to climate policy or not. But I do not care about population growth. Of course, I should care about population growth because it's an important contribution to whether or not I want to do something about climate change or not. But it can be added straightforwardly, but that will be, again, an exogenous component rather than an endogenous component. Okay, so what are the insights for climate policy from such a simple rule? Well, first of all, in economic terms, the usual economic cost-benefit analysis tells you that if I know what my marginal cost of climate change is, so the social cost of carbon, then it would be rather clever to set this marginal cost of climate change to the marginal cost of abatement. So I will do something against climate change up to the level that avoiding the extra ton of carbon in terms of economic capabilities, or in changing to renewable energy or CCS or whatever backstop technology I might have available, equals, so that the cost that I have to put into my infrastructure for that has to equal the cost that I avoid by doing this action. So that basically tells you that you want to set the global carbon price equal to the social cost of carbon. And given this rough rule, it tells you that the social cost of the global carbon tax should be increasing at the rate of GDP. So it's not a fixed number, but this number should grow over time. It should grow at the rate of GDP. Well, it also tells you that the social cost of carbon, or the carbon tax, should be high if you do not discount the future generations' well-being a lot. So the lower your discount rate, the higher the carbon tax. And that's, again, rather straightforward. If you just think about it here, if I lower my discount rate, I lower my R, and I divide by a lower number. That's the straightforward thing about it. And so your social cost of carbon will be higher. Higher growth in living standards, I already talked about. This boosts the interest rate simply because you're saying that these people are richer in the future, and so I shouldn't put too much weight on them, and so their damages in the future should be discounted more heavily, and so it depresses the optimal carbon price if the intertemporal inequality aversion is greater than 1. And so as future generations are better off, we are not prepared to make a sacrifice for them in terms of climate change. I think, the other components are simply that a higher intergenerational inequality aversion implies that current generations are less prepared to tamper with future climate change if there is growth in living standards. So again, if I think that the future will be richer, if I increase the IIA rather than the G, in the sense that IIA is greater than 1, they have the same effect, that this lowers the social cost of carbon. And if the lag between the impact of the temperature or the damages and the emission of social cost of carbon, or so a greater lag or a faster depreciation also lower the social cost of carbon because it's less of a problem, right? So either it happens later in time, which means I discount it more heavily, or it goes away more quickly, so it's less of an economic problem. So those are the simple insights that you get from a simple tool like that. Now, why would I care about the social cost of carbon? And I think I would like to link it up again with this externality argument that I started out with, and to say, okay, so what is the effect of a carbon tax, and why should we be using it? Well, here I use again the simple framework that's, I think, rather insightful to think about the energy transition. So we want to use the social cost of carbon because it should help us to get off fossil fuels, and it should help us to get off fossil fuels quicker than we would without the social cost of carbon. And so you can think about my cost of using fossil fuels, I call them F here, and let's say there's a standard cost of them, and there's some innovation in it, so the cost of fossil fuel decreases if there's a shale gas boom or some other ingenious invention. But we also assume that in general, as the stock of reserves is being depleted, that this cost of extracting extracting fossil fuels increases. So I have to go to pre-salt, I have to go into the Arctic, I have to go to ever more remote places to find my fossil fuel deposits, and that's associated with a direct cost of going there, digging the thing out of the ground, and bringing it to my power plant. On the other hand, we just assume rather simply that there is a renewable alternative, renewable R, which again starts out with a cost today which is equal to R0, and it falls over time at an exogenous rate because some of the effects that we talked about before, but I'm not building them in explicitly, I'm just saying over time renewables will become cheaper. So that's again technological innovation. So now hoping that the rate of innovation in fossil fuels is slower than the rate of innovation in renewable energy just because it's a more mature technology, I will then get a point where I have a transition to renewable energy, where I'm basically saying, well, if the component of the one energy type has a certain price, and the component of the other energy component of the renewable alternative has a certain price, and then I want to stop using the one and switch over to the renewable alternative if their prices are equal in terms per unit of use. And so the transition of energy will happen if the two prices are equal. And so if I don't have carbon policy or a climate policy or a social cost of carbon added to it, I'll just say what is the cost of physically getting the thing out of the ground and burning it compared to generating it through renewable energy. And that would change if I add in my carbon tax or the social cost of carbon on top of it. So you see that the social cost of carbon is driving a wedge between the different energy sources. And so if the social cost of carbon is positive, which we all assume since we think that there's a damage associated with climate change, then this FT will be smaller than this FT because, yes, the social cost of carbon will be higher, right? So this is how economists think about the social cost of carbon and the carbon tax and what it's supposed to be doing. And, of course, an additional component is, I didn't make this explicit here, but the T's will be different also. So not only will you use less fossil fuel, but you also abandon fossil fuel at an earlier point in time. So this is the workings of, in a simple model again, of the global carbon tax. So working through this, and I didn't put up the expressions, but it's rather straightforward to do this. Actually, you can do it on the back of an envelope if you want to. You can then just say, okay, I want to compute this T at which I will switch. I know my expression for the carbon tax. I know my components for the renewable and for the fossil fuel component. And basically what this will give me, it will give me a component of the amount of assets that have to be abandoned. So how much of my fossil fuels will I not be using? And I can compare this how much I will be using if I don't have a carbon tax. So I will know the difference. I also will know what my carbon budget will be as a difference from my FT, so I know how much FT, so how much fossil fuel I will have used. And then that will also, there's recent evidence from a climate scientist in Oxford who basically says, well, in order to know how much your peak warming will be, you only need to know how much of carbon you inject into the system. So you don't need to know the trajectory of your energy use. You just need to know what your carbon budget is, and this translates rather neatly into a projection of what peak warming will be. So then, if I know my carbon budget, I should also know what my peak temperature increase would be. So that basically then gives you a straightforward handle to think through the different components of climate economics. On the one hand, you want to know what the social cost of carbon and carbon tax should be, what is my cost-benefit analysis, what are the implications for renewable energy and for fossil energy, and what will be the implications for peak warming. And so I hope that to have made clear to you with about half an hour of my talk, to tell you what the key workings are of the climate change economic debate. Now, then, of course, as I say, it's a very neat thing. We're a bit proud of it, I must say, because you can actually then go and use the back of the envelope and think about, okay, what does this imply? And maybe even you want to fiddle around with it and say, okay, let's say I do not agree with Nordhaus and I do not agree with Stern. I want to know what my social discount rate should be. I'm not sure that this is actually... So ignore the SDR column, but I want to know if I plug in a different rate of time impatience or rho, or if I put in a different incremental inequality version, I can know what my initial social cost of carbon would be based on the rule that I just showed to you. And I can think about what my peak warming will be because of the assumptions about the energy, fossil and renewable energy, and what my carbon budget will be. Now, so you see basically, again, the simple insights are, on the one hand, that you get a rough estimate of what the social cost of carbon would be. This would be growing with at the rate of economic growth. That tells me what my peak warming is, and the important thing again is that this compares to business as usual if I don't have any carbon tax. With a peak temperature increase around 4 degrees of Celsius, I can bring this down with these parameter combinations to somewhere between 2.2 to 3 degrees of Celsius. And of course, this is with the built-in finding or fact that we are already committed to somewhere between 1 to 1.3 degrees Celsius of warming. So this is the economics of it, and this is basically what we want to do. So there you have a simple cost estimation of the social cost of carbon. And now I'd like to come back to this idea about the efficiency. So what I hope to have shown, basically, with the last slides, is that you see that there is this wedge that you want to bring in. And what are the implications for welfare? And that's the sacrifice debate that we had before. And basically, if I set my tax equal to 0, I would be at an inefficient allocation because of the externality. I would be using more fossil fuels. I would be creating more climate damage. So my line here gives me how much I can consume and how much can I divide my consumption between the present and the future. Or let's say it's in utilities already, I think. That makes it easier. But the important thing is, so I have the dotted line, which is my possibility frontier. If I don't do anything about climate change, then I'll lose a certain chunk of it due to climate change, or I can reduce a little bit more if I avoid climate change, so I don't have all these hurricanes and these floods and these droughts and these wars and a mass migration and all the other things. And ideally, we would like to see is that we can move from a point where we are here, which would be the intertemporal allocation, to a point which is the optimal allocation if I impose the missing price signal, which is the social carbon tax, the social cost of carbon in the form of a global carbon tax. Then I would move to a point of tangency and efficiency, which is over here. Now, this, again, links up directly with what we've talked about in this workshop for the last couple of days and what we actually heard in the first opening keynote by John. I implicitly drew the point like this where we would have no sacrifice. So we could obtain efficiency and make everybody better off. Now, that, of course, might not be the case. So why should I do this, and why would I get to this point? So what are the economic workings in the background of this? Again, I am using a neoclassical optimal growth framework, and what we basically get is the first point that I already made clear, is that if you don't have a carbon tax or another form of climate policy, investments are done on purely economic or private cost basis. So I'm just thinking about how much does it cost me to dig the thing out of the ground and bring it to and burn it in my power plant. And so the problem compares with the case where you want to act socially. So of course you want to impose the social cost of an action on an individual, and the social cost then implies that you should add the social cost of carbon. Now this gets a bit more tricky if you think about the case that we have here, because here I'm not just saying that I have a component where I have a big cake and I'm dividing up the cake between, I think Ron used an example of this sort, where you have a big cake and there are different slices, and the one slice is my consumption today, the other slice is what my consumption is tomorrow, and there might be a slice that I have to give up for climate change, and doing something with climate change might shift this around. In the economic optimal growth frameworks, we usually also say, well, you have to make certain decisions, and you have to make a decision between consuming something today and investing something today to leave it for the future. So it also implies some capital investments that you have to make. And then if we go further, the question of climate change then is the question of the portfolio allocation. So how do I want to change my portfolio between climate assets or green renewable technology and brown technology? And so this is basically what enters here. And the problem is that if you don't consider the social cost of carbon, is that you basically, in an economic, and this might only be for the economists in the room, but so basically what you have is an optimal growth framework in which you have rational expectations. So in each point in time, everybody knows that climate change will be happening, but the externality point of it basically tells you that you don't think that you're causing it, right? So I know that there will be an increase in hurricanes, and I know that I will be poorer than I am today because of climate change, if it's severe climate change, but I don't think that I'm the one causing this. So this is the way that the optimal growth framework would think about the externality case. And of course, if going back to what I showed you about the interest rate before, if you think that the future will be poorer, then of course your interest rate will be lower, right? Because you would want to shift some of your current consumption into the future in order to provide those poor souls which are facing an exogenously changing climate with more capital assets and give them more material well-being. And so that's in a way the reverse response of the interest rate is then that the interest rate is too low and that people want to save too much and under business as usual for future generations because they don't think that they're the ones causing the climate problem. So in a way it's a bit of a Greek tragedy in the sense that they're causing their own misery without knowing so at the beginning. Okay, so that's just an aside for the economics of it. And here I just have two graphs which might, again, coming from a simulation exercise where we basically the red line is the BAU case and the green line is the mitigation case. So if you don't have your externality internalized, you'll be facing lower interest rates than you would otherwise. And that's, of course, important for discounting climate change. In any way. So that's just as an aside. But of course, as we know from our workshop, that the idea of efficiency without sacrifice is very appealing. But what might turn out, and that might be true, is that actually, given my cost calculations, and I might actually be wanting to achieve efficiency which goes beyond the no sacrifice space, and also includes a sacrifice for current generations. So I would decrease, ignore the axis. I drew the axis incorrectly here. So here you would have, okay, so basically what I want to say, you have the future on the vertical axis and the present on the horizontal axis. And basically what you want to have is that you have, the future is much better off, but the current generation, the present generation, has to give a bit up in order to achieve efficiency. Now, what is the implication of this? And I think it's really worth thinking about this, just to keep that in mind for our debate about the ethics of it. This is an optimal program. So this is basically a program in which I maximize the discounted utility of all future generations. And the way that economists tend to think about this is that there is a representative household in the point today who makes considerations about savings and consumptions in order to maximize the consumption at this point in time, or the utility, or the material well-being, if you want to call it, and the well-being of future generations. So you have a built-in intrinsic consideration for the well-being of future generations. So that's the reason for savings in the first place, but that also tells you if I get some benefit of saving and bequeathing a better environment to my offspring or future generations, then you see that this is not a sacrifice. It is a sacrifice in material terms. So I achieve efficiency in terms of material, I achieve efficiency, and I have a sacrifice in material well-being. So I'm willing to give up a certain level of my consumption today, but in terms of my overall well-being, which includes my regard for my future, I am better off. So it's still utility, it's maximizing utility, and so the current generation is better off. And in that sense, it's not a material sacrifice, but it's rather a regard for others. Yes, it's an altruistic regard, but a material sacrifice. And I think that's also important to think about this and keep this in mind, that you actually avoiding climate change and correcting the externality is welfare maximizing. And if you have regard for the future, which we assume in our frameworks, then this going to the point which includes a material sacrifice should not include utility sacrifice or well-being sacrifice in the broader sense, because I'm willing to make that sacrifice because what I suffer today in material terms is not outweighed by my increase in well-being because I know that the future is better off. So that's, I think, the distinction that we should keep in mind when we talk about the efficiency with or without sacrifice. It's material sacrifice. Okay. And so again, sticking with the example, and I'm bringing these examples now, and I fear I might be going over time a bit, but I'll just do that. And so we talked about numbers a bit, and I think some people complained again about what are the numbers, what are people really thinking what are ballpark numbers for such a thing. And so here I'm basically plotting in red again the BAU scenario relative to the optimal outcome. And what you see is, okay, so in this case, as I drew it with the incorrect axis on the previous slides, is that you see that there is the first period of people, or the consumption, the first period, is a bit higher on the business as usual. So there's a small, tiny sacrifice of the present generation, but all future generations are better off already. So the period 2 of period 3, period 4, in these periods consumption will be higher because of climate policy. So there's really a small sacrifice, but there is a sacrifice. However, the interesting, I think I can skip this point, I already made this point. You can distribute the efficiency gains of moving from the inefficient allocation in such a way that you don't have a sacrifice, right? So this is the point about the efficiency without material sacrifice, to a point which is this orange line. And this orange line, I increased my inequality aversion somewhat, so I put a bit more weight on current generations in distributing the efficiency gains. And so they get a higher consumption level today, and they're compensated. And the future is also compensated. And so you see there's no overlap between the red and the orange line, so the orange line Pareto dominates the red line. And of course, it's still below this will be below the optimal for some point, because there is some, you have to give up some of the future benefits and give them to the present. It doesn't come for free. But it comes for free in terms of relative to BAU. So there is a free lunch available for multiple decades compared to the efficiency point. And so then again, I checked the numbers for our integrated assessment model, our small integrated assessment model. Of course, this implies we do a little bit less for the climate, but here, in our scenario, this doing a little bit less for the climate is very temporary, so it only means that you have a delayed mitigation response, but you still achieve more or less the same peak warming limit. So moving the point where I include this is if you use the numbers that we have in our integrated assessment model, and if you believe them, then it's easy to move away from the sacrifice. The sacrifice would be very small, and you can move to a case where you have efficiency without sacrifice, without an increase in peak warming. It's just a response. It's just a transient response where you ramp up mitigation somewhat slower, but you still outpace it in the further down the line. You can think that you're doing some negative negative carbon emissions later on. Okay, so it's a question of distribution. I think we're all aware of that. And here is another thing where some numbers again. Now I'm using the DICE model, which maybe has more credibility, although again we should really think about the DICE model a bit more carefully, but people like to use it, so we also used it here. And this point also bears out in the prominent DICE model. So if I associate, so let's say my representative agent is split up in different generations, and let's say I have 7 or 8, I forgot, generations, and they all get the equal share of consumption at that point in time, and I add up their lifetime utilities, you see that the BAU case is below the optimum case. So if you implement the externality scenario in DICE, and then you compare it to the optimum, you see that there is again a little bit of sacrifice, but it doesn't bear out in terms of lifetime utility for different generations. So there is no sacrifice in that sense. There's efficiency without sacrifice at the full optimal program in DICE. And I think that's just maybe a point that people might be interested in when it comes to how the numbers bear out. Now, in the last, can I take another 5? I mean, we started 5 minutes late, right? So I kind of.
Okay. Yeah, take 5 more.
I get 5 more?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh.
Or as much as you need. But
okay, good. I'm a bit. I thought we started at 1:15, but we started at 5 or 10 past. Okay, sorry. Anyway, so then I have to rush through the other points of it. So far we thought about. So that was the state of my thinking a couple of years ago, and then of course the interesting question is, well, we have this built-in regard for the future, and of course most of the surveys that we look at tell us that people have a regard for the future. People think that we have a certain duty, a moral obligation to think about future generations, and they actually name this regard for future generation as an important motivation to fight climate change. So the story about the regard for the future does bear out in the surveys, but as a thought experiment, you could also say, well, let's think about the case where I completely disregard the future. I'm just very self-interested, and I don't live very long, and so you would think that there are different generations at different points in time, and they might overlap for a little bit, so you have these causal linkages that also John alluded to in his talk, but I don't care what happens after I'm dead, right? I mean, the world could go to pieces once I'm dead, and I don't care about this. But there are still certain arguments for why you could implement the cases and distribute the efficiency gains. And policies for doing that we discussed in the workshop include public debt issuance, or you could do something like a social security aspect. Or one point that hasn't been talked about too much, and which I'd like to emphasize, is the case of asset prices. And so I think that's a very good story that I read in the Financial Times a couple of months ago is Bangladesh is deciding to industrialize its economy, or continues to strive to industrialize its economy, and they're aware of the fact that they'll need a lot more electricity in order to feed this drive for industrialization. And so they thought it would be a very good idea to build coal-fired plants, which of course from an economic change perspective is not a good idea. But the irony of it is that they also decided that they're going to build these coal-fired plants in low-lying, flood-prone lands. So basically, Bangladesh is one of the lower-lying countries, which is very prone and affected by sea level increases in the future due to climate change. And they decided to build coal-fired plants in these floodplains, which is ironic if you think about it. But anyway, so they're doing that. But then you could think about, okay, returning to the case about asset prices, what will be the value of an asset? And here, economists tend to think about, well, if, I don't know, Matthew wants to sell me something, and that's an asset which has future payoffs, what will I be willing to pay Matthew for this asset? Well, I would be a good economist. I would sit down and say, okay, so next period I'll get maybe 10 squid, and then I'll get another 10 squid, and then maybe at some point I get 20 squid, and then I get nothing. So basically I would add up what I get from this asset over time. Now, again, as you might know, thinking about the social cost of carbon, it's not correct just to add up these numbers. I should discount them, because instead of paying Matthew for his asset, I could also go to the bank and deposit my money there and get future payoffs just because of the interest that I get on my bank account. So basically what you say is that the price of an asset should be the marginal profits again, and I'm ignoring that here, but it should be the discounted sum of all future marginal profits. Right? So if I have an asset and the Matthew wants to sell me, I would pay him what this asset is in terms of the discounted sum of future profits. Now, thinking about climate change, as I mentioned before, climate change is a very systemic problem, and so it has the potential to influence the profitability of future assets. And so if I think that this influence on future assets is negative, as across the board one could argue it is, because of the hurricanes and because of the floods and everything, then I should also see some negative impact of climate change on the valuation of assets today. And so even though I might not be caring about the future because I'm caring about the people and their well-being in the future, I might still be concerned about climate change because the things that I'm owning today, my house at the beach, or my Bangladeshi coal-fired plant in the low-lying floodplains, or the Houston refineries, because they're exactly where the hurricanes usually come through, then the value of these assets should depend on climate change. And there's an increasing literature on this, that the assets capture future states or are sensitive to future states of the environment. And so there is a channel where you, as the owner of assets today, or we as a society of owners of assets today, might not just be concerned about future well-being, which we are, but even if we're not, we might be concerned about the value of our wealth. And this value of our wealth will depend on future states of the environment. So I will be willing to do some climate change mitigation just in order to increase the value of my assets. Now again, it's a question of magnitudes and how far this channel will get us, but this is an additional channel, and I think that's an interesting channel where people will be, it's an active area of research, and I think it's undervalued and underappreciated in the debate. Now, of course, that also brings us to something else that we talked about in our workshop is, well, this might be true on average, but of course there's a large portfolio of assets, and some of these assets will become valued higher because of climate change, but some other assets will be decreasing in their profitability, and some of them might become completely obsolete. So coming back to the simple framework that I showed you at the beginning, you can think about these amount of assets that I'm able to, fossil fuel assets that I'm able to burn with or without climate policy, and of course the difference between them, the difference between the carbon budgets on business as usual and on the policy is a set of assets that are completely useless if there's no CCS or possibilities of reducing CO2 from the atmosphere is available. So that's an interesting debate that one should think about And that's an active, stranded assets is an active area of research as well. Now, in my final remarks, I would like to make the claim, and that would be interesting to discuss maybe in the discussion section, is that basically we know that the efficiency without sacrifice tells us that climate policy does not involve us trading off our well-being against that of future descendants. So the numbers that I showed you basically tell us that even if there is a sacrifice that's small, and even if there is a sacrifice, there are other mechanisms which might compensate for this small sacrifice. And in any case, I could distribute the efficiency gains in such a way that there are no sacrifices, which have very small effects on peak warming that they imply. Now, then the question, of course, is, well, why don't we see a transition to low carbon or even a carbon-free economy today? If the underlying economics are so straightforward, then everybody must be busy at work getting rid of CO2 in the atmosphere and our CO2 emissions. Now, of course, there are two important problems. One of them is the problem of the commons and the prisoner's dilemma that John also mentioned in his introductory and opening speech. And my thinking has come that far to say that I believe that that's actually the bigger externality. So you could see that coordination problem as an externality. And I think that's the bigger externality, or the one that's harder to overcome. That's the problem, that also is at heart at the failed efforts at an international scale to impose lasting and stringent climate goals. And of course, it's also a question of political economy. So there you have, on the one hand, the international political economy of nation states trying to, trade off who's to bear the cost. And on the other hand, of course, I think, and that's also an area that I would say is under research in economics, is the question of general versus vested interests. So who's involved in political decision-making and political processes, and whose interests are represented and whose interests are not represented. And you could make the argument that there are vested interests and special interest groups which are seeking policy and are good at seeking policy, and they are able to implement a policy which is good for them but not good for the general public. And that also contrasts sharply with, I also alluded this a bit at the beginning or during my talk, with the acid rain problem where pollution was local, so you didn't have this transboundary pollution problem, you didn't have this international dimension to it, and secondly, it was very easy to get substitute for this harmful technology, or basically to add scrubbers to avoid the emission that caused the acid rain problem. Okay. Then, of course, there are further issues which I'm unfortunately not able to touch upon in my talk, but I think that's an area one should think about. On the one hand, we have to think about commitment across time. So this is a topic du jour for economists who care about intertemporal decision-making and who are saying, well, if I'm willing to do something about climate change today, who tells me that the generations 30 years down the line will not just say they give up on climate change? And so here's that basically gets you into questions of commitment and credibility. My take on the issue is that the best way to deal with that issue is to implement policies which make it cheaper and easier to move away from fossil fuels in the future. So if you think about the renewable elements, again, that we talked about before, you have to have this equality and no arbitrage condition between different sources of fossil fuel, and market participants will only pick up the renewable alternative if it's cheap enough to do so. Now, I assume that this price is decreasing exogenously, but of course it's subject to research and development, and you can increase efforts to make it cheaper in the future. So that would be a good way to make sure that people use the technology if you find a way to make it cheaper and today and in the future. So if you invest today to bring down permanently the cost of these energy alternatives, then of course if you have these policies, that becomes a bit murky when you don't have carbon tax to supplement the renewable subsidies. So that brings us into the German Energiewende problem, where people are using a lot of renewables, and they have been very successful in ramping up the amount of renewables that in the mix of energy generation. But there's still some fossil fuels, and the fossil fuels that are being used are the most dirty ones, which are coal-fired plants, because you're not able to complement the subsidy policy with a carbon price to make sure that the fossil fuels that are being used are the ones which have the least carbon content in them. And a much bigger question, of course, is how do we think about the rationality of markets? the whole story that I told you so far built on the idea that there are rational agents in the economy who have perfect information, that there is perfect competition in the market, and that people have rational expectations, so they know what's going to happen in the future. But maybe the reality of the market economy is much messier than we know, and maybe we're not at full employment, so this might then create this possibility of utilizing resources that are not utilized today for climate policy, so that will be a win-win strategy. But of course, it also raises a lot of other real-world and real political problems that we would have to think about, which I abstracted and away in my talk. So I'd like to end with a piece of good news and a piece of bad news. So the good news that I can present to you is that fighting climate change does not come at an opportunity cost. We can do it and basically make everybody better off. And in terms of economic costs, substituting fossil fuels for renewable energy is rather cheap at the levels that we're supposed to do it to avoid the most dangerous implications of climate change, to stay within 2 degrees of warming. And so that there you basically save, it's at most people save 2% of GDP today, perhaps even less, so it could be as lower than 1% of GDP. And if you think in terms of investment, that means that up to 10% of investment should be redirected towards renewable energy. So we have an investment share of about 20% of GDP, and so of this investment, you want 10% to go towards renewable energy as a ballpark number. Now again, I'm abstracting of some of the issues that we talked in our workshop, where we talk about changing the networks that we're using, infrastructure. There are, of course, networks effect, deployment effects that have to be considered, but on a grosso modo, you can say it's about 1 to 2% of GDP. Of course, the bad news is, and maybe so might be ending on a bleak outcome, is that we only talk about climate change, but of course the global economy has many more implications for our biosphere. And so in a piece that has been picked up rather widely, people tried to compute the safe operating space for humans in the world. And so they flagged 3 cases in which we're overstepping the safe operating space. The first one is climate change. So here you see that we are beyond the safe green area that's at the center of the world. And then there are 2 more. One of them is the nitrogen cycle, which is associated with fertilizers. And so that's so in their consideration, we have outstepped our safe operating space a lot more. And of course, a huge problem, I think also in terms of climate ethics, is that we have the biodiversity loss. So something that's not easily quantified in economic costs is that the way that we're interacting with our environment is that there's a huge loss of biodiversity and extinction of species, and that's, of course, a problem also. So there's not just climate change, there are also issues that we have to think about when we think about our interaction with nature. Thank you.